Hi, I'm Roxanne Wilson, and we will be talking about IOA. IOA is Inter-Observer Agreement, and it is a measurement we use in applied behavior analysis to make sure that our target behaviors are being measured the same by every person. For example, if a child has a target behavior of mouthing, you would assess inter-observer agreement by having two people read the operational definition and take data on the target behavior at the same time for the same amount of time. And at the end, you would see what their agreement is. Are they getting the same amount of target clicks or are they not? And this is a good way to determine if our operational definition is good enough, and it also helps determine if there is some sort of observer drift from the definition. It basically helps keep our science and our programs on par with everybody else and keeps us all clicking and taking the same data. The 4 benefits of IOA. So the first 2 we have here are competence and observer drift, and those are proactive. These help the researchers understand if their observers are competent in taking the data and measuring them the same. I can remember as a new RBT, in order to work with a new client, I had to do IOA, a competency check, to make sure that I was able to get 80% on the IOA and measure the targeted behavior correctly. Now, observer drift is when the observers start to have all of the same data, they're measuring the same way, and then a month or 2 goes by and their data starts to be different because the definition for one of the observers changed a little. So I have an example. I used to work with a client that we counted screams, and my co-therapist and I started getting measurements around the same. And then after a couple weeks went by, we came back for IOA and noticed that our measurements were off. And when we discussed it, it was because in her mind, the definition changed a little to where she stopped tracking screams that the client was happy. She only was counting screams where the client looked upset, like her eyebrows would be furrowed, or she'd have more of a angry face and her fist would be clenched. And I was counting all of them. So luckily we did IOA and we caught that, and we talked to the BCBA, and we did end up changing the definition. So the next 2, these are more descriptors of measurement across observers. So number 3, it gives the readers of the research article confidence in that our data is trustworthy, it's believable, it just makes you feel more comfortable that you can trust the data. And then number 4 is the data reflects the change in behavior. So I believe that IOA gives us the confidence in the research article that the behavior was manipulated or changed by the IV, the independent variable, not by like outside environmental effects. I know we're not working in a Skinner box, but we do the best we can to contrive and keep the environment right for what we're trying to manipulate. But IOA helps the reader and it helps the researcher feel confident in that the behavior we're changing was affected by the IV. So here in the little blue box, we have the IOA procedures that we will discuss. And it is important to note that behavior is defined by its repeatability, its temporal extent, and its temporal locus. It's important to make the note that the type of IOA procedure you use is selected by the type of data you are collecting to measure behavior. And the type of data you are collecting depends upon the behavior you are measuring. So just to reiterate, we pick our IOA procedure depending on the type of data you are measuring. There are 3 criteria for IOA. They seem very simple, but you'd be surprised. So it's good to go over it. The first one is that the observation code or the measurement system you use should be the same. You are measuring the same thing, you are measuring the same way, so they should be exactly the same. The second one is that you should be observing the same participant and the same events because you are measuring the client's behaviors. So obviously you should be looking at the same client. Also, the third one, this can get a little tricky. You should have no influence from anybody else. So typically, if a trainer is working with a new hire and they're trying to get IOA, I as a trainer would just make tally marks, and I would do it in a way that the other RBT can't see me. I don't want her to hear me click, him or her. I don't want them to hear me click. I don't want them to see me make a tally. I want them to get their own data to make sure that we agree. We will start with data obtained by event recording, and this means for event recording that it's count, rate, and acceleration. And these are the 4 event recording IOAs that we will be talking about. So here we have the total count IOA. This is the simplest and most crudest form of IOAs you can do. It's used for event recording data. And in this, you take the 2 agreement counts that the observers get. So you put the smaller count on top of the larger count to get, and then you multiply it by 100 to get the total count of the IOA percent. So there is a flaw with total count, and that is there is no guarantee the observers are getting the counts at the same time. So say you're tracking for 30 minutes. It could be that the observer 1 is tracking the first 15 minutes and observer 2 actually ended up tracking the last 15 minutes. So that means that they are not tracking the same data. So that's the issue with total count IOA. It's still used, it's just not used as often. The next one is mean count per interval IOA. And this one is also an event recording. The difference between this one and the total count IOA is that the mean count per interval IOA breaks the target behavior that we're watching, the session, it breaks it down into intervals so we can get a more accurate data collection of each interval. So on the next slide, I'll give you an example. Okay, so here's some pretend data, and you can see that there are 2 observers and that the times are broken up into 30-minute intervals. So what I did here was observe for the first one 8 to 8:30. Observer 1 had 9, observer 2 had 12. So I did 9, the smaller one, divided by 12, and that equals 75%. So I measured that for each one of the 30-minute intervals. Then, in order to get the mean count per interval IOA, you add up all of the IOA percentages you divide that by how many observations you have. Here we have 4, so I divided it by 4. You multiply it by 100, and here we got 90.3% IOA, which is high, and that would mean that our operational definition is good, that there is no observer drift. This is exactly what we want it to look like. Moving on to exact count per interval IOA. This IOA is the most stringent form of IOA for data that is event recorded. And it is similar to the mean count per interval IOA in that it takes your observations and it breaks it into intervals. So it makes it a little more accurate. And you can see here the equation says number of intervals of 100% IOA. And that just means it's the total percent of intervals that the observers agreed on. So if 2 people are observing one behavior, you would have to click in that interval the same number. So say we're clicking mouthing, and in a 30-minute interval, I got 5. In order to get 100% IOA, the other person has to get 5 in that interval. And this is what makes it a little harder, because it is hard to get exactly the same each time. We don't always catch things at the same time. The operational definition really has to be good here too. It's definitely checking on that. And then you divide by the number of intervals. And then you multiply all that by 100 to get the percent. And that will get you the exact count per interval IOA. Okay, so here we have some data, and we are doing exact count per interval IOA. So you see that we have the interval times, which is 30 minutes for each session. We have 2 observers, and in order to get the IOA per interval, you take the smaller number divided by the larger number, which is exactly what we did in the mean count per interval IOA. So that step is the same. You take 2 divided by 3, and you get 67%. You have to multiply it by 100 to get the percent. You do 3 divided by 3, times that by 100, you get 100%. 1 divided by 2, you multiply that by 100, you get 50%. So here you can see in the IOA per interval row or column that they only agreed on 2. They just so happen to be 100%. So that those are the only 2 that they agreed on. So here's what we did. We do the 2 times that they agreed on, the second row and the last row, and you divide that by the number of intervals you did. So we had 6 observations, so you divide 2, the agreed amount, divided by 6, and then you multiply that by 100, and you get 33%, which is definitely not high for IOA. Okay, so since we are doing a BST, a behavior skills training, I want to see that you guys can actually do the calculations with me. So what we're going to do is we're going to observe some behavior. The behavior is tapping. My lucky fiance got to take these videos for me. So we're going to observe some videos, and then we are going to tally our tapping, and then we're going to actually calculate the IOA of the exact count per interval. And here I made this operational definition, so let's see if it's good enough. I defined it as any instance of client using an object or hands to strike another object or body part for at least 2 consecutive strikes, both soft and hard taps count if it meets that criteria. So one instance stops and a new instance can begin after 3 seconds of calm. So I'll give you guys an example. This would be considered 1. That's 1. Now, this would be considered 2. Because it had a 3-second pause in between. Now, it did say they can use their hand, so same thing. That's 1. They can tap their body. And I did put some examples here. So an example would be the RBT is sitting next to the client and sees the client striking a pencil on the desk for 3 consecutive strikes. That's a definite occurrence. Now a non-example would be if the client is holding a marker and sets the cap down loudly 1 time. That is not an occurrence.
Start timer. Stop time. End timer. And I am starting the timer.
Now we're going to move on to trial by trial IOA. This is different than the ones we just learned about in that trial by trial IOA doesn't count the number of times the target behavior happened in an interval. It just tracks if the target behavior occurred in the interval or not. So in your intervals, you would put a plus or minus if you see the maladaptive behavior. So trial by trial IOA is subject to the same issues that total count IOA is. So it overestimates the extent of actual agreement and does not indicate how many responses or which responses or trials the item pose agreement problems. So the math here is that we do 2, the ones that they agreed on, divided by 4, the number of observations or sessions, and you'll get times it by 100, and you'll get 50%. I do want to make a quick note here that trial by trial IOA is used for DTT, which is discrete trial training. That is when we use this IOA. Now I will move on from event recording IOA, and I will move to time duration, which is how long the behavior is occurring. That's the target behavior. IRT, which is inner response time, how long in between from one behavior to the next behavior. So say we're counting head hits. You would count the time in between head hits. That's IRT. Response latency would be the time of how long it took the behavior to respond to the demand. So the time between you say, go wash your hands, to the client actually starting to stand up and attempt to go wash hands. And the ones I will be talking about is total duration IOA and mean duration per occurrence IOA. So total duration IOA is very much like total count IOA, where you take the shorter one and divide it by the longer one. Here we're talking about duration. So you take the shorter duration divided by the longer duration, and you multiply that by 100, and that gets you your total duration IOA. Okay, so we do have some problems with the total duration IOA, and that is that it provides no assurance that the observers recorded the same durations for the same occurrence of behavior. And it shows that here in our data. So what I did was I added up each one of the observers' response. I took the smaller one divided by the larger one, and I multiplied it by 100. And that's 94% IOA, which seems very high. But when you look at the data, you see that they actually only have the same response for number 4. So they only got the same second count on their response 4. And all of the other ones have about 6 seconds of a margin difference. So it seems that it's saying that our IOA is higher than what it actually is. And that is our problem with the total duration IOA. Mean duration of occurrence IOA is another type of IOA we use for duration measurements. It is a more conservative and meaningful assessment of IOA, that is duration measurements. And this is the equation here. It looks very intimidating, but it's really not. It's actually very simple. All it is saying is that you take the duration IOA for response 1 for both observers, plus duration of IOA for response 2 for the observers. You divide that by the number of responses, you multiply it by 100, and that will give you the mean duration per occurrence IOA. So I want to do an example of how to do the mean duration per occurrence IOA using the same data we used for the total duration IOA, so we can compare and see the accuracy. So what you do is you take response 1 for both observers, and you do the small one divided by the larger one, so you get 0.83, and you do that for each response. So response 2, 15 divided by 21, 0.71. 7 divided by 9, 0.78. 14 divided by 14, 1. 14 divided by 17.82. Then you add all of those up, you get 4.14. You divide that by the number of responses, which is 5. Both observers saw 5 responses. You multiply that by 100, and the IOA is 83%. So it's pretty good, which is exactly what we want. Now we discuss IOA obtained by interval recording. And interval by interval recording is when we take a session and we break it into equal parts of intervals, and we decide if the behavior has occurred or hasn't occurred. So here you're not telling how many times, you're not counting duration, you're just counting if it occurred or if it didn't occur. And the types of IOA that we use for this is interval by interval IOA, scored interval IOA, and unscored interval IOA. And I will explain those in the next slides. Interval by interval IOA. This is the equation. What you do is number of intervals agreed divided by number of intervals agreed plus number of intervals disagreed. And then you multiply that by 100, and it will give you the interval by interval IOA. I wanted to give an example of interval by interval IOA so you could see it work in an equation. But I do want to explain first that this type of IOA overestimates the accuracy of IOA. And it does that because if you look here between observer 1 and observer 2, you have 50% chance of guessing the same one as your co-therapist, the other person observing. So it's likely that you, even if you're not watching the behavior, could guess the right one. So here, what we did was we took 7, which is the number that they agreed on, divided by the number they agreed on and the number they didn't agree on, times by 100, and you get 70%. So even though it's interval by interval IOA, it's only 70%, which does not meet the requirement for IOA. So even with the possible inflated percentage, it still doesn't meet it. I do want to clarify here, even if it is not an occurrence, if they're both zeros, you still count those as agreed. It's just meaning that you agree on if a behavior occurs or does not occur. Scored interval IOA, this is the equation for it. You do the number of both observers agreeing on occurrence. So you only count the ones that they agreed that there was an occurrence, and you divide that by the number that they agreed on occurrence plus the number they disagreed on occurrence. So if they both say that there were no occurrences, you don't count those. You only count the ones that they disagreed on an occurrence or the ones that they agreed on an occurrence. So for behavior that occurs at low rates, scored interval is a more conservative approach than the interval by interval. And that's because it ignores the intervals in which agreement by chance is highly likely. So here's the same data that we took for interval by interval, and you take all of the ones that they agreed a behavior has occurred. So all of the slices that have 2 X's. Here we have 4. There are 4 that they agreed on. You divide that by how many they agreed on, 4, and how many occurrences did they disagree on, and that's 3. So you could see in 1, they disagreed. Someone said there was an occurrence, someone said there wasn't. In 6, someone said there was an occurrence, someone said there wasn't. And then 8, same thing. You do 4 divided by 7, and you get 57%. So with our interval by interval, that gave us 70% IOA, and here we're saying 57. So you could see why this is more accurate to use of IOA for low rates of behavior. When sampling behavior, such as with partial interval, that is when you check if a behavior is happening in an interval. And then you have, it's called whole interval recording, and that tracks if the client is doing the target behavior the entire interval. And then you have momentary time sampling, and that's if you look to see if your client is doing the targeted behavior when your timer goes off, so at a specific time, at an interval of time. And play check is similar to the momentary time sampling in that you look to see if the clients are engaging in the target behavior, but play check is more for groups. And when you're using these samples for behavior, then you're going to want to use the IOA of interval by interval or scored interval IOA. We have some IOA guidelines here, and the criteria for IOA is that it needs to be at least 80%. Much like most of our clients' programs, the criteria is 80% for mastery. Here, IOA needs to be 80% to prove that it's good enough. Now, the research standard says that 33% of our observations should be having IOA. So at least 33% of that with your co-therapist or maybe with your trainer. Now, what to do if agreement is low? We've already talked about agreement can be low due to the operational definition or observer drift, but what do you do if it's low? More training. That's the biggest key is more training. If you have a strong operational definition, then you should be getting the same data. So that means that more training needs to happen. It's also really good to do client meetings. So have the whole team of the client meet for 15 minutes once a week, and that really helps get everything in order. It helps everyone agree and understand the criteria of the operational definition. It's also kind of nice to have team meetings to get ideas too. You know, oh, I see you're getting pluses on this data. What am I doing differently than you? It's a good way to get everyone on the same page. I read this really cool article, and it helps support everything I'm telling you about the exact count per interval, the mean count per interval, and the interval by interval IOA. So this article was by Oliver C. Mudford, and the purpose of it was to illustrate the difference in percentage accuracy depending on the equation they used to compute it. So they had 12 participants, and some of them had masters in ABA, some of them did not. And what they did was they showed them 6 different videos that had a target behavior with an operational definition. They had to watch these videos, and then they had to evaluate their IOA using these 3 what's the word I'm looking for? The 3 equations. They're looking for the 3 equations. They had in the article, there was a different name for the equations, but it's the exact same equation as the ones that we're going over. So this article stated that the exact count, the mean count per interval IOA, and the interval by interval IOA are all good and stringent IOA measures for counted behavior, but they do have their downfalls. So it's important to know these so you can pick the right one for each targeted behavior. So the exact agreement and the interval by interval, it showed in this research article that they are unsuitable at high rates and duration for opposite reasons, with one being excessively conservative and the other one being too liberal. Now, the exact count and the mean count per interval, they showed that this may produce inflated indexes of accuracy at low rates and durations. So when you have low rates and low duration, you're probably going to want to use the interval by interval. Yeah. It was a really cool article, and I was happy that I found something that basically showed us that you could get an even better IOA based off of the measurements that you're using. So in conclusion, I know that was a ton to go over, but I'm going to try to sum it up a little bit just to stick it in your brain. So when we are counting behavior, the total count is the crudest because the observers could be counting at the wrong times. So in an interval, one could be counting in the beginning and one could be counting at the end. So total count is definitely the crudest when it comes to counted behavior. And the more stringent method for calculating IOA is to break them into intervals. So exact count per interval is probably the most strictest, and it's the one that you should use if you want the most accurate IOA. You always want to use the most strictest that you can. And for trial by trial IOA, that is used for DTT, discrete trial training. And then when it comes to timing behaviors such as duration or IRT or duration, you should use the total, the mean, and the interval by interval. And those are the most stringent for timing behavior. Now, when sampling behavior, such as using play check or partial interval, whole interval, multiple time sampling, you should use interval by interval or scored IOA. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.